Welcome to Brooklands Members TV and Podcasts. I'm Tim Morris and I'm here today with Harry Sherrard. Now, Harry is the author of two articles that have been recently published in the Brooklands Bulletin. They're looking at the effect of the Battle of Britain on Brooklands. Of course, one of those effects was the terrible raid on the 4th of September 1940. And Brooklands Museum are actually holding a service on the 80th anniversary of the attack to commemorate those who lost their lives and were injured. But today we'll be looking back 80 years and talking to Harry about the build-up to that raid and what actually happened on the day. So Harry, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to see you. Good to be on Brooklands TV, Tim.
Excellent. And basically, Brooklands was a pretty active place before the war, with German racing drivers and German airmen would be visiting the circuit and the airfield. How much intelligence do you think that the Luftwaffe had about Brooklands prior to war being declared?
Yeah, the Luftwaffe had plenty of intelligence, as you say. German aviators and motorists were at Brooklands in the run-up to the outbreak of the Second World War, and through the 1930s, although Hitler was getting increasingly belligerent, there were near normal relations really between the countries, and so the Germans and the Luftwaffe in particular were completely aware of the Vickers and the Hawker factory. To the extent that they were able to compile an intelligence sheet that they drew up on the site, including the factories and the other infrastructure, and it actually and a map as well. And it got down to specifics because they actually allocated target numbers to sites at Brooklands, so that the Vickers factory was target number GB747, and that the airfield was a target number 1028. This all happened like 6 months before the war broke out. So from that point of view, the early intelligence of the Luftwaffe was pretty comprehensive, actually.
Clearly, Vickers and Hawkers were aware of that, and they were aware that German drivers and airmen had been on site prior to hostilities breaking out. Were they preparing for a conflict as war approached? What actions did they take specifically really to prepare for an attack on the premises? And as a follow-on to that, were there any other measures that the government were taking generally to prevent air attacks from the south coast?
Well, taking your questions in reverse order. So as far as the defence of the Britain was concerned, yes, we had what was called the Dowding system, named after Air Chief Marshal Dowding, and that involved the installation of what we now know as radar installations all along the south coast and along the North Sea coast as well. Back then it was called radio direction finding, or RDF. The word radar was kind of thought up later. So in brief, the system was that RDF would pick up raiders coming across the English Channel. But what I think a lot of people don't realise about radar or RDF was that it only looked out over sea. And as soon as German raiders crossed the coastline and were actually over southern England, radar actually had no role to play. And it actually fell then to the Observer Corps. And they had various stations all along the south coast armed with binoculars and a little instrument that they could look up and visually see the planes flying overhead. They could estimate their numbers, their speed, their direction. All of this information from first the radar and then Observer Corps was then fed into a central command and control system. They analysed the information. They in turn fed out instructions to the various RAF bases. They would then scramble fighters to meet the incoming raiders. And that command and control system and the Dowding system was absolutely crucial in the Battle of Britain. There's a few myths about radar at that period. Some people say, or some people think, that the Germans didn't have radar and they didn't know what radar was, which isn't actually true. The Germans knew exactly what radar was and how it worked, and they had their own radar. But what they didn't understand was the command and control system that I just mentioned. They thought that the radar installations were all localized and they just were able to inform RAF stations in their immediate vicinity. What they didn't realize was all this information was fed up to a central command and control system, and then the information sent back down the line as I just described. So it was a very important aspect of the Battle of Britain. So turning to Brooklands itself, in the interwar years, one area that was neglected really was anti-aircraft weapons, anti-aircraft guns, and really there weren't anything like enough anti-aircraft weapons available, but some were installed at Brooklands and around the Weybridge and Addlestone area. So there was a certain amount of anti-aircraft fire available for incoming raiders, but there was no way in which those anti-aircraft guns were going to be able to fight off a full-on raid. So going back to the dowding system, the real key to defence of Brooklands was early warning, knowing where the raiders were, where they were coming from, and attacking them with other aircraft before they even got to Brooklands, because Brooklands was undoubtedly extremely vulnerable. So in addition to the regular army putting gun emplacements around the place, the Vickers employees formed a unit of the Home Guard. We all know about Dad's army and so forth, but in actual fact that portrays maybe an uncharitable version of the Home Guard. They actually in many ways were more effective than the legend of Dad's army would suggest. So there was a unit of Home Guard formed, and because Vickers had connections with the armament industry, they were actually quite well armed in actual fact, and they had guns placed on the roof of the Vickers factory. 6 Bren guns and twin Brownings were installed up there to take part in defensive measures if there was a German raid. So there were certainly, as I said, a level of armaments around the site, etc., but still it was very vulnerable.
Clearly, but it doesn't seem an awful lot to me, and knowing what was coming. I'm sure they could have done quite a lot more really to try and protect Brooklands. It was such an obvious target from the air, being a great oval.
Yeah, well, we'll maybe come on to that later in the talk, because the oval was disguised and camouflaged to some extent early on in the war, prior to the Battle of Britain and prior to the big raid on the 4th of September. But after that raid, a lot more was done to camouflage.
Okay. You gave a talk on Operation Sea Lion to the members last year. I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that and how that particular operation led to the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, the Battle of Britain is very well known, and most people, I guess, have seen the movie and they know the broad story of the Battle of Britain. What is less well known is Operation Sea Lion. Going back in time, we all know about Dunkirk, and the Germans reached the French coastline very quickly. Britain evacuated over 300 troops, Allied troops, from the French beaches and so forth. But in truth, the Germans actually reached the French coast much quicker than they actually expected themselves, and they didn't have equipment, and they didn't really have a plan for a cross-channel invasion. So again, many people would probably have seen the movie Darkest Hour in the last couple of years. Hitler didn't really want to invade or attack Britain if he didn't have to, so he made overtures and tried to get Churchill to agree to terms, to a peace treaty with the Germans. Churchill, of course, as we know from that movie, he was, of course, implacably opposed to that, and he rejected any suggestion of appeasement. So the Germans then realized by about July or so that there wasn't going to be any treaty with the British, and therefore an invasion was going to be necessary. So they had to use a lot of barges and other craft that they had in the Rhine and other Central European rivers, because we're quite familiar in 1944 with landing craft, all landing on the beaches in Normandy and the doors coming down and troops and machinery coming out. That equipment didn't exist in 1940. There weren't any landing craft, so the Germans had to improvise and use what equipment they had, and they gradually built up an invasion force in the French and Belgian ports through the summer of 1940, with a view to trying to launch some kind of an invasion in September or maybe October. So the Royal Navy was actually very strong, and some Royal Navy veterans, they feel sort of slightly left out of the story, if you like, because the fact that the Royal Navy in the Channel was so strong and so much stronger than the German Navy was a major factor in all of this, because without air superiority, there was no chance at all of the German invasion fleet getting across the Channel. It undoubtedly would have been knocked out by the Navy. So a prerequisite of even trying the invasion had to be air superiority. And really that set the stage, therefore, for the Battle of Britain and the attempt by the Luftwaffe to destroy British air bases and the fighter command, so that they could get this air superiority as a prerequisite to the invasion.
Okay, as part of that, there was an attack on Brooklands, as we've mentioned. Main attack came on the 4th of September 1940. But was that the first time that Brooklands had been attacked from the air?
No, there was a smaller attack on the 24th of July, 1940. There was a single Dornier bomber dropped about 18 bombs. Quite a few of them missed. They kind of exploded harmlessly, but 5 of them exploded on the track, and some of them were quite near the Vickers factory. So it did cause a bit of damage to the infrastructure of Brooklands, but not really too much. And the guns, the anti-aircraft guns that I mentioned earlier on, they did open up and they did fire at the Dornier, but none of them hit it. They didn't succeed in hitting the bomber, which went off after the bombs were dropped.
Was there much damage done on that occasion, or is it?
No, there wasn't a great deal of damage done. There's always and we'll come on to this again later on, but there's a difference between what might look as if there's a level of visible damage, but actual material damage to the equipment. So in terms of the latter, there wasn't really any damage done to the actual aircraft producing machinery, but a little bit of damage done to the infrastructure generally. But that raid, whilst relatively minor, of course, it was a foretaste of things to come.
Which indeed came on the 4th of September. That would have been a normal working day for the factories at Brooklands. Could you actually talk us through what happened leading up to the raid and the raid itself? I'm sure it was very quick.
Yeah, well, the first point is that it was a very carefully planned and executed raid specifically targeting the Vickers factory at Brooklands. So there's no question of the Germans coming over, just roaming across southern England and saying, look, that looks like an interesting target, let's bomb there. It was absolutely planned from the start as an attack, not just on Brooklands, but specifically the Vickers factory. So the aircraft they used was the Messerschmitt 110, which it was a twin-seat, twin-engine, primarily used as a fighter, but it could also be put into light bomber specification. So a group of the Luftwaffe that specialized in low-altitude, high-speed bombing were equipped with these 110s, and they were targeted. There were 14 of them, and they were all briefed at an airbase in northern France that morning that their target was going to be Vickers factory, and they were given obviously all the navigation coordinates and so forth to get there. But in addition to the 14 attackers, there were also a large number of diversionary aircraft. They were all also Messerschmitt 110s, and the total force that took off from northern France was about 100, in fact, and they all obviously headed towards the south coast. They were picked up by radar, and RAF fighter squadrons were scrambled, and various dogfights took place, and a number of the 110s were shot down. But the actual raiding party, they only lost 1 aircraft out of the 14. The other 13 were unscathed, and they headed off at low altitude in the direction of Brooklands. Now, the other diversionary 110s did, I guess, a pretty good job. It was a pretty sunny, warm day, but there's quite a lot of haze in the sky. So I mentioned earlier on that once the raiders had crossed the coastline, so they had given that diversion to the raiders to get inside the RDF, the radar screen. So they're now inland, and we're now relying on the observers to follow them. That's very difficult with binoculars and the naked eye, trying to follow aircraft on a high altitude in a sunny day. And the truth of it is that the 13 raiders were completely missed, and the diversionary tactics by the other 110s effectively were successful. So the 13 raiders arrived at Brooklands at low altitude, came out of the sun, and they were completely undetected. So I mentioned earlier on about the guns that were installed at Brooklands, including the Home Guard and the guns on the roof of Vickers factory. But unfortunately, none of them were actually able to brought to bear on the radars because the whole thing just happened so quickly. So they'd set off from northern France kind of late morning. I don't think they planned it necessarily in this precise way as how it turned out. I don't think they could have done really, but they'd set off from France late morning. So when they arrived at Brooklands, it was the end of lunchtime, and the Vickers factory operated a clocking in and clocking out system. And many of the employees had stayed outside to kind of gather as much of the late summer sunshine as they could. But many of the employees were queuing in the area where there was the clocking in mechanism to clock back in after their lunch break. And by fluke, by a pretty disastrous fluke, one of the bombs dropped by one of the 110s burst through the factory roof, and it actually exploded quite near the clocking in system. And rather tragically, there was a large concentration of workers in that area, and of course a lot of them were obviously killed by that explosion. There was nearly 90 workers were killed by the explosion, and about 400 were injured.
Yeah, certainly it was a terrible day, really. But I gather that production did actually resume fairly quickly after the raid. Perhaps you can tell us what effect on production there was and what further measures were then put in place to improve the defence of the site and minimise any further loss of production.
Yeah, the the machine shop and the wing shop and the repair hangar were all damaged. And when members get their bulletin, excuse me, and look at the photographs, superficially you say, my goodness, the place was absolutely destroyed. And certainly it does look like a scene of absolute devastation with all there was a glass roof element to it and everything, and all of that smashed up. So it does look terrible. But there really is two different things. Destroying the fabric of a factory is relatively easy by dropping some bombs on it, but unless you're scoring direct hits inside the factory, you're not necessarily doing an awful lot of damage to the actual aircraft production machinery. And the reality is that none of the bombs really did this damage any of that essential machinery within the factory. So there was obviously a massive clearing up operation that went on to clear up all of that damage to the fabric. But the Brooklands staff quickly realized that in actual fact the main machinery hadn't been damaged, and they were able to get everything up and running again within really not that many days.
All production at that time was based in the main factory, which was the one alongside the finishing straight.
Yeah, that's correct. Anybody who is familiar with immediate pre-war photographs or film of racing events taking place at Brooklands, you'll always see the very large letters of Vickers on the wall, as you say, on that large factory just alongside the finishing straight. So yeah, so production really got back going again really within a number of days. But the key measure that the management took at the insistence, obviously, of the Air Ministry was dispersal. And so rather than having all of the production at that one site, and obviously in continuing to be in a rather vulnerable place, a program of requisition of suitable buildings was undertaken very quickly. And machinery was removed from the factory and taken to all kinds of buildings. So warehouses, garages, engineering works, even a film studio in the local area was actually requisitioned, and the machinery and the workers that operated that machinery were then based over quite a wide area. And even Windsor Great Park had a small satellite factory installed within it. So production continued pretty much apace, very little interruption or even reduction in the number of Wellington bombers and other aircraft being produced at that time. And it actually reminds me a little bit of the current situation that we're in at the moment, the way workers have been dispersed and everybody's now working from home rather than working in a central location. It almost as analogous with what Vickers did, and just as we have been able to manage through the crisis today, Vickers managed then with a dispersed workforce and a dispersed factory to carry on producing. But as far as the site itself was concerned, obviously defensive measures were ramped up. More anti-aircraft guns were installed, but the main measure that was taken really was camouflage. So, as you mentioned, Tim, I've put two articles in the members' bulletin So if members go back to the earlier bulletin where I was writing about the role of Brooklands in the Battle of Britain, there's a number of photographs within that article that shows the camouflage that was installed. So there were fake buildings, fake hangars, and some real buildings as well were actually installed, but that weren't actually material to the production. There was all sorts of netting put up over the top of the track, so that as you mentioned earlier on, this oval was very visible from the sky. Oval was disguised by the netting, and various other measures were taken so that it wasn't nearly so obvious a target. As far as other defensive measures are concerned, there were various barrage balloons were put up. So a balloon would go at about aircraft flying height above Brooklands with a chain running down to the ground. And if an aircraft came in, they would obviously have to try to avoid the balloons, but if they tangle up with the balloons, the chain potentially could destroy the aircraft and bring it down. So they were obviously a deterrent, therefore, for any further Luftwaffe raiders.
Yeah, just going back to the raid itself, we talked about the Vickers factory. Obviously, Hawkers had a factory on site as well. Was that actually affected?
No, that was unaffected by that raid. It actually very specifically, and there is a surviving logbook from one of the 13 raiders that actually went in that day, the Luftwaffe pilots, and in his logbook it clearly says Vickers, Brooklands as the target. So maybe they had a plan potentially further down the line to attack the Hawker factory, but certainly on that day, on the 4th of September, it was very specifically targeted at Vickers.
So they were specifically after Wellington production, presumably bomber production, rather than fighter production.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what I was saying about the Battle of Britain generally and Operation Sea Lion, one aspect of that period, which isn't all that well known, is that Bomber Command were very heavily involved in defensive measures too, using the Brooklands-built Vickers Wellingtons. We all know about Fighter Command tangling with the Messerschmitt 109s over southern England and the dogfights and so forth. As I said, it's a very well recognized story. But as I mentioned, the Germans were amassing an invasion raiding party in the Channel ports with these barges and various other aircraft. And Bomber Command were therefore dropping bombs along the French and Belgian ports to try to destroy the invasion force. And it was a relatively early stage in the war. The bomber pilots were pretty inexperienced, and unlike the southern England, the Germans actually had lots of what they came to know as AK guns, anti-aircraft guns. So they were inflicting a pretty heavy toll on the Wellington pilots. So so coming back to your question, the Germans were obviously aware that in order to protect their invasion fleet, they had to limit as much as possible the activities of Bomber Command, and one way of doing that was to go back to source, as it were, to go back to the Vickers factory, destroy that, and therefore prevent the production of Wellingtons, and thereby protect the invasion fleet from further attacks.
Yeah, that would certainly make sense. If you're a visitor going to Brooklands today, is there anything that's on site now that can remind you of the defence measures that were taken?
Yeah, one of the big gun emplacements is up near the Members Bridge, the Bofors gun, a Swedish word. They were imported from Sweden in the interwar years, and the installation is still actually visible up there. Also along the finishing straight is the air raid shelter, which is probably inadequate really if you think in terms of the magnitude of the potential of a raid in Brooklands. It was a relatively small raid. So those two things are still visible, but not really very much else, because obviously the Vickers factory itself is long gone. As you've gathered, from the story, the authorities at Brooklands had taken some defensive measures, but they were badly caught out really by the magnitude and the intensity and the accuracy of this attack. I mean, really, it was their worst nightmare unfolding when the attack took place, and it was after that then that they realised that they really would have to ramp up defensive measures in all the different ways that we mentioned.
Yeah, of course, there were the two large hangars that were one on the finishing straight and one underneath the Members Bridge, which were the dispersal hangars for Wellington production. I think those air raid shelters were probably built in conjunction with those.
Yeah. Those hangars, the Bellman hangar that stood in the finishing straight for nearly 70 years and then was removed in the last few years to when the finishing straight was restored. That was certainly built after this period. And again, as you say, it was all part of this process of dispersing and spreading out production rather than having one large, easily identifiable target.
Yeah, it certainly does seem logical to do that when you think about it in hindsight. They obviously didn't think about it beforehand, but yeah, I believe that places such as Woolworths in the High Street and Weybridge were also used. So they were using not only small garages, warehouses and things like that in the local area, but even shops.
Yeah, it's remarkable, really, the extent of the dispersion. Obviously, we're talking about Brooklands specifically, but other manufacturers did similar kinds of things. So Supermarine, for example, who were building the Spitfire down in Southampton, again, obviously they were rather spooked by the Brooklands raid, and they of course were attacked as well. And all aircraft manufacturers did similar things. So again, around the Southampton area, there were various shops and all sorts of premises building parts of Spitfires that were then brought to a central location and then assembled. A very similar thing going on in the Weybridge area. The airfield, of course, was, you could only disguise an airfield to a certain extent, and obviously these aircraft that were being built at Brooklands were being flown out of Brooklands, so therefore, you know, the airfield itself had to remain operative throughout the whole period. But remember, the raid itself took probably less than 3 minutes. By the time, you know, the raiders were first seen coming over the boundary of Brooklands. Obviously, the klaxon alarm was set off, but you know, as we said earlier on, it all happened so quickly that none of the guns actually were brought to bear on the raiders at all. So when they left Brooklands, the 13 aircraft that attacked it, they reformed then with their diversionary aircraft that I mentioned earlier, the other 110s, and that they set off then to fly back to France. The fighter commander, of course, very much on the alert now. They realized the attack on Brooklands had taken place, and they scrambled Hurricanes, also built at Brooklands, of course, but they scrambled a squadron of Hurricanes from RAF Kenley, and they then engaged the 110s as they flew south towards France. They did succeed in shooting down a number of the German aircraft. So it was a costly raid, really, for the Luftwaffe as well, because on the way in and the way out, they lost a total of 15 aircraft destroyed. Some pilots bailed out and survived, but a total of 17 German Luftwaffe crew lost their lives in this raid. So, as I said, it was actually pretty costly for the Germans as well. One notable point, though, is that of all the 110s shot down on the way back to France, none of them were the actual raiders. So the 13 aircraft that had bombed Brooklands all landed safely back at their bases in France. It was only the escorts that were not knocked down, and obviously they, in doing that, they fulfilled their purpose.
Following that raid, were there any more air raids on Brooklands at all?
Yeah, there was a reasonably large air raid on the 6th of September, just a couple of days later. Again, also attacked by 110s and also some Junkers 88s. They attacked the Hawker factory, and there was an unexploded bomb that fell, which could have done a lot of damage. So with a bit of courage from bomb disposal, the bomb was deactivated and removed. It could have caused a fair bit of damage, in fact. But really, the story at the Hawker factory was similar in the sense that whilst there was damage to the infrastructure of the building, and superficially, you know, it looked as if the raid had been quite successful, in actual fact, there was very little damage done to the actual machinery inside the factory. So production of Hurricanes was relatively mildly interrupted, and again they got going again within a few days.
So there were another couple of little attacks there, but this was 1940, and obviously the war continued quite a bit longer than that. They were still making Wellingtons, other aircraft, Hurricanes in great quantity at Brooklands. Why did they not attack again?
Well, yeah. Towards the end of middle of September, 21st of September, there was a single Luftwaffe aircraft that dropped a couple of bombs on the Hawker factory. Did a little bit of damage again, but didn't once again really seriously disrupt production. Well, the answer to your question, Tim, really is because of a major change in strategy by the Germans, which of course in the long run turned out to be completely disastrous for them. They had tried, as I mentioned earlier, all through the summer months to destroy the RAF, both in the air and on the ground, by attacking the RAF bases and RAF infrastructure generally. But their intelligence on the number of RAF aircraft was quite poor, and they kept thinking that the breakthrough was just around the corner. But of course, squadrons were coming down from the Midlands and from the north, and even if squadrons were badly damaged in the south, there were sufficient resources to rearm them. And another point to make is that even at this stage, the German economy was not on a full war footing, whilst arguably Britain actually was. And through this period of the summer, Lord Beaverbrook had taken over aircraft production ministry, and he was a very capable manager. And we were actually producing more Hurricanes and Spitfires in particular than the Germans actually were producing fighters. So our production was actually stemming the flow, if you like. So in frustration, the Germans realized that they were never going to knock out the fighter command in the kind of attritional warfare that they thought they would through the summer months. So in September, there was a major change of strategy, and they decided to attack London. Now, that was obviously disastrous for the residents of London, and that led to the period that we know as the Blitz. Up until that point, Hitler, of course, had walked into Paris, an undamaged Paris. He'd conquered France without any bombs or any fighting actually taking place in Paris itself. He'd hoped through the Battle of Britain that he could do the same thing, and that he could walk into an undamaged London as the conqueror. And that's why the bomber crews were prevented, and they were ordered not to actually damage London for many months. But as I said, in the middle of September, that completely changed. And rather than attacking fighter bases and trying to actually engage the fighters directly, they attacked London in large numbers. Now, history, of course, tells us that that kind of area bombing, and the same applies really for the RAF, who, and the Americans later in the war, of course, who bombed Germany. You know, that kind of aerial bombing of cities and civilian centres and so forth causes tremendous loss of life and carnage on the ground. But it actually doesn't do a lot to damage the opponent's war effort. And as we've said a number of times earlier in this talk, the production of Wellingtons and Spitfires and Hurricanes, continued unabated, despite the aerial attacks, and really attacking cities didn't do an awful lot to damage the British war effort. So production carried on. Then the other big event really that took place was in the spring then of 1941. Hitler, of course, then, and the German forces attacked Russia, and his attention really was taken away from Britain, and a lot of the Luftwaffe resources were, of course, diverted east, as they had to be, to support Operation Barbarossa and the attack in the east. Really, Britain stopped being a priority in that sense, and the big priority became attacking Russia and trying to reach Moscow and conquer in the east. And yeah, clearly it was a major blunder on the part of the Germans. In the short term, as you say, Tim, it enabled Brooklands and other factories to continue to produce aircraft. In the medium term, England, of course, was one great big runway from which those aircraft could take off and attack Germany. And had the Germans successfully taken Britain out of the war, then that wouldn't have been the case. How could we have actually attacked mainland Germany? It would have been really impossible in the early and middle stages of the war. And of course, the other reason then was D-Day, as I mentioned briefly earlier on. In June 1944, the Americans and the other Allied forces were able to amass on Britain and then depart the invasion force on the 6th of June from southern England and invade mainland Europe. And France initially, and obviously onto Germany then. Well, again, if Britain had been taken out of the war, then that launch pad wouldn't have been available for the invading forces. So when you look back on it, it was really a catastrophic decision from the Germans' point of view to start bombing British cities and not actually to try to destroy the RAF and to mount an invasion.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was a turning point in the war, really, wasn't it? Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Harry, for that insight into Brooklands and the Battle of Britain, and particularly the raid on the 4th of September, which we are marking the 80th anniversary of on the 4th of September with the special service at Brooklands. You can read Harry's articles in the July and September editions of the Brooklands Bulletin. And of course, that is only available to Brooklands members as part of your membership benefits. Thank you very much, Harry.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's been good talking with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.